Greenwich Village, New York City. The 1980s. If you were walking down Sullivan Street on a Tuesday morning, you might have seen a sight that was common, yet deeply unsettling. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a tattered navy blue bathrobe and worn-out slippers, is wandering aimlessly. He's mumbling to himself, gesturing at thin air, his hair disheveled, a look of complete confusion plastered across his face. Sometimes he's seen talking to parking meters. Sometimes he's standing in the rain for hours, staring at a brick wall. To the average tourist, he's a tragic figure, a neighborhood soul who has lost his grip on reality. To the local police officers, he's the odd father, a crazy old man who's more of a nuisance than a threat. But as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen over the Manhattan skyline, that same man enters a small, nondescript storefront called the Triangle Civic Improvement Association. Inside, the crazy act vanishes. The mumbling stops. The eyes sharpen. The men inside, tough, hardened criminals, stand up out of pure respect. This man, Vincent the Chin Gigante, wasn't just a local character. He was the most powerful mafia boss in America. While the FBI was busy chasing flamboyant gangsters who loved the spotlight, the real power was being wielded by a man who convinced the entire world he was insane. But here is the question that still haunts the history of organized crime: if you spend 30 years pretending to be a madman just to keep your power, at what point does the mask become the face? Would you sacrifice your dignity, your reputation, and your very sanity to rule an empire from the shadows? Before we dive into the dark heart of the Genovese crime family, you need to understand something. The mafia isn't just about flashy cars and expensive suits. It's a world of extreme discipline, where the smartest man in the room is often the one you'd never notice. This is the story of a man who played a 30-year game of chess against the United States government, a story of a family that became the Ivy League of organized crime, and the shocking betrayal that finally brought the bathrobe-wearing king to his knees. You think you know the mob? You've never seen anything like the reign of Vincent Gigante. The story of the Genovese family is the story of the American dream turned into a nightmare. It began in the crowded tenements of Lower Manhattan, where Italian immigrants arrived with nothing but hope and a fierce sense of loyalty. Among them were the Gigantes. Salvatore and Yolanda Gigante were hardworking people, a watchmaker and a seamstress. They had 5 sons. Most of them were good boys. One even became a priest. But Vincent was different. Vincent was born in 1928, right as the Great Depression was about to strangle the world. He was a big kid, athletic and tough. In the neighborhood, they called him the Chin, a play on his mother's Italian pronunciation of his name, Vincenzo. He wasn't a scholar, he was a fighter. By the time he was 17, he was a professional light heavyweight boxer. He had 25 professional fights. He knew how to take a punch, and more importantly, he knew how to wait for his opponent to make a mistake. But the boxing ring couldn't offer the kind of power Vincent craved. The real power in Greenwich Village didn't wear boxing gloves, it wore fedoras. This was the era of Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, the titans of the underworld. Vincent started as a Shylock and a muscle man. He was a protege of Vito Genovese, a man known for his brutality. Early on, there were signs that Vincent was more than just a thug. He was quiet. He observed. While other young mobsters were bragging about their crimes in social clubs, Vincent stayed in the background. He learned the value of silence. But he also had a streak of recklessness that nearly ended his career before it truly began. In 1957, Vito Genovese decided he wanted total control of the family. The only thing standing in his way was the legendary Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld. Genovese tapped his young protégé, Vincent Gigante, to do the job. One night, as Costello walked into the lobby of his apartment building, a voice rang out, "This is for you, Frank." Vincent pulled the trigger. But in his excitement, or perhaps due to a lack of experience, he didn't aim properly. The bullet grazed Costello's skull, circling around the skin rather than entering the brain. Costello fell, but he didn't die. It was a botched hit, the kind of mistake that usually gets a young mobster killed. What happened next, however, changed everything. At the trial, Frank Costello, one of the most powerful men in the world, looked directly at Vincent Gigante and claimed he couldn't identify his shooter. Costello chose the code of silence over revenge through the law. Vincent walked free. But he had learned a vital lesson: the legal system was a theater, and if you played your part correctly, you could beat it. After the Costello hit, Vincent's reputation grew, but so did the heat from the authorities. He spent some time in prison on drug charges alongside his mentor, Vito Genovese. It was in those cold prison cells that the plan began to take shape. He saw how the high-profile bosses were targeted. He saw how their egos were their undoing. He decided that if he ever rose to the top, no one would even know he was there. By the late 1960s, Vincent began his most elaborate performance. He started checking himself into psychiatric hospitals. He claimed he heard voices. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. His family, including his brother the priest, swore that Vincent was a sick man. This was the birth of The Odd Father. It started slowly. A few missed meetings. A bit of mumbling. But soon, it became a lifestyle. To the public and the FBI, Vincent Gigante was losing his mind. To the Genovese family, he was becoming a ghost. The Genovese family was always different from the Gambinos or the Lucchese's. They were the Ivy League. They were more secretive, more disciplined, and more profitable. While John Gotti was doing interviews for Time magazine, the Genovese members were forbidden from even mentioning their boss's name. If they had to refer to Vincent, they wouldn't speak. They would simply point to their chin. But this success would not last. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the Genovese family became a money-making machine. They controlled the docks, the construction industry, and the Fulton fish market. They had their hands in the pockets of unions and politicians. And at the center of it all was the man in the bathrobe. The genius of Gigante's act was that it served two purposes. First, it made him a legal untouchable. If the government tried to indict him, his lawyers would argue he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Second, it created a perfect screen for his operations. Who would suspect a man who wandered the streets in his pajamas of running a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise? He lived a double life that was exhausting to maintain. He had two families. He lived with his mother in Greenwich Village, where he performed his crazy routine for the neighbors. But he also had a secret second family in the Upper East Side, a mistress and 3 children. To keep the ruse going, he had to be Chin the madman during the day and Chin the boss at night. He was obsessed with security. He never used a telephone. He never spoke inside a building that hadn't been swept for bugs. He conducted business during long walks in the rain or while whispering in the back of moving cars. He was a master of the front boss strategy. He let other men, like Fat Tony Salerno, take the title of boss. Salerno was the one the FBI saw at the social clubs. Salerno was the one featured on the news. Salerno was the lightning rod. But behind the curtain, it was always Vincent. When the FBI finally launched the famous Mafia Commission trial, in 1985, they targeted the heads of the 5 families. They put Tony Salerno away for 100 years, thinking they had decapitated the Genovese family. They had no idea their empire was already beginning to crumble, but not for the reasons they thought. The FBI eventually started to realize they had been played. They noticed that even after Salerno went to prison, the Genovese family remained the most stable and disciplined. They started listening closer. They heard whispers from informants. Men who were tired of the strict rules, men who were afraid of the crazy man's unpredictable temper. Because that was the secret, Vincent Giganti wasn't just playing crazy to fool the cops. He used his perceived instability to keep his own men in line. If the boss is a little bit off, you never know what will set him off. He ruled through a combination of brilliant strategy and absolute terror. But the fatal flaw in any mafia empire is always the same: greed and the passage of time. The younger generation of mobsters didn't have the same discipline as the old guard. They wanted the money, but they didn't want the bathrobe. They wanted to be like John Gotti, they wanted to be stars. The rivalry between the Genovese family and the Gambino family became a clash of philosophies. John Gotti was the dapper Don, wearing $2,000 suits and smiling for the cameras. Vincent Giganti despised him. He thought Gotti was a clown who was bringing too much heat to the Cosa Nostra. Giganti actually plotted to have Gotti killed. Not because of a business dispute, but because Gotti had violated the rules. Gotti had murdered his own boss, Paul Castellano, without the permission of the commission. To Giganti, this was an unforgivable sin against the family tradition. The tension grew. The streets of New York became a powder keg. Giganti tried to use a remote-controlled car bomb to take out Gotti's underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. The hit missed Gravano but killed another high-ranking member. This was the beginning of the end. The violence was becoming too loud to ignore. In the early 1990s, the FBI finally got the break they needed. They managed to plant a bug in a place Giganti thought was safe, the townhouses and social clubs, where his top lieutenants met. They didn't hear Giganti's voice, he was still too smart for that, but they heard his name. Or rather, they saw the gesture. They watched through hidden cameras as high-ranking mobsters pointed to their chins while discussing million-dollar rackets. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who had survived Giganti's bomb, decided to flip. He became the highest-ranking mobster to ever testify against his own. Gravano confirmed what the FBI had long suspected: Fat Tony Salerno was just a puppet. The real boss, the genius of the village, was Vincent Giganti. In 1990, the government finally moved in. They indicted Giganti on charges of racketeering and murder. But as the agents arrived at his mother's house to arrest him, they found him in the shower, fully clothed, holding an umbrella. What happened next changed everything. The legal battle that followed was one of the most bizarre in American history. For 7 years, Gigante's lawyers managed to delay the trial. They brought in world-renowned psychiatrists who swore that Vincent was suffering from a litany of mental illnesses. He had a low IQ, they said. He was demented. He didn't even know what year it was. The Odd Father routine reached its peak. Gigante would show up to court in his bathrobe, escorted by his children. He would sit in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the ceiling, sometimes drooling, sometimes mumbling prayers. To the jury, he looked like a grandfather who belonged in a nursing home, not a federal prison. But the prosecutors had a secret weapon. They had tapes. They had witnesses who had seen the Chin, in his private moments, conducting business with perfect clarity. They had evidence of him playing pinochle and discussing complex construction bids. The trial was a spectacle. The media couldn't get enough of the crazy boss. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Gigante's health really was starting to fail, the stress of the double life finally taking its toll. The heart that had beaten with the rhythm of a champion boxer was now struggling. In 1997, the jury finally reached a verdict. They didn't buy the act. They found him guilty of racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. Even as the judge read the sentence, Vincent sat there, looking confused, a man lost in his own world. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. But even behind bars, the mystery of Vincent Gigante continued. For several years, the FBI suspected that he was still running the family from his prison cell. They realized that his children and his mistress were acting as messengers. The bathrobe was gone, replaced by a prison jumpsuit, but the insanity act continued. He was placed in a medical facility for prisoners, where he lived in a world of silence. The final turning point came in 2003. The government was moving to indict his son, Andrew Gigante, for acting as his father's messenger. They were threatening to put his son away for a long time. For the first time in 30 years, the mask slipped. In a shocking plea deal to save his son, Vincent Gigante stood up in court. He didn't mumble. He didn't stare at the ceiling. He looked the judge in the eye and admitted the truth. He admitted that his insanity had been a complete fabrication. He admitted he had been faking it for decades to avoid justice. It was a moment of profound irony. The man who had built his entire empire on a lie finally had to tell the truth to save the thing he loved most, his real family. At the time, it seemed insignificant to some, but to the world of organized crime, it was the end of an era. The Odd Father was gone. He was just an old man who had finally been caught. Vincent Gigante died in prison in 2005. He was 77 years old. His funeral was a quiet affair in Greenwich Village. There were no fleets of black limousines like there were for the bosses of the past. There were no thousands of mourners lining the streets. The Genovese family had survived him. But the world had changed. The era of the secret boss died with him. Today, the Genovese family is still considered the most powerful and secretive of the New York crime families. They learned their lessons from the Chin. They stay out of the tabloids. They don't wear expensive suits in public. They operate in the shadows. But what is the legacy of Vincent Gigante? He was a man who won the game but lost his life in the process. He spent 30 years of his prime pretending to be a broken man. He lived in a self-imposed prison of his own design long before the government ever put him in a real one. He gave up the ability to walk down the street with his head held high. He gave up his dignity. He gave up the chance to be a father and a grandfather in the light of day. He thought he was the smartest man in the world because he fooled everyone. But in the end, who was the real victim of the odd father act? He traded his sanity, or the appearance of it, for power. And as he sat in that cold prison cell in his final days, one has to wonder if he looked back at the man in the navy blue bathrobe and realized that the performance wasn't a trick he played on the world. It was a trick he played on himself. The Genovese family still exists, whispering in the corners of social clubs and construction sites. But they will never see another leader like Vincent Gigante. He was the man who proved that in the world of power, the greatest weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's the ability to make your enemies look the other way. As we look back on the story of the man in the bathrobe, we are reminded of a chilling truth. The most dangerous people in the world are rarely the ones shouting from the rooftops. They are the ones mumbling to themselves on the street corner, waiting for you to walk by, pretending they don't see you, while they quietly decide your fate. Vincent Gigante achieved everything he ever wanted. He ran the most powerful family in the country. He defeated the FBI for decades. He became a legend. But he lost the only thing that truly matters, the right to be himself. And that is a price most of us would never be willing to pay. In the end, you'd never guess who was really running the Genovese family, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But the shadows eventually fade, and even the odd father had to face the light. What do you think? Was the insanity act a stroke of genius, or was it the ultimate tragedy? Would you live 30 years as a madman if it meant you could be a king? Let us know in the comments. This was the rise and fall of Vincent the Chin Gigante, the man who wore a bathrobe to hide a crown. The worst mistake was still ahead, they say, but for Vincent, the mistake was thinking he could keep the mask on forever. Because in the underworld, as in life, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep you bury it. And as the sun sets over Greenwich Village today, Sullivan Street looks much like it did 40 years ago. But if you see a man in a bathrobe wandering the sidewalk, you might look a little closer. You might wonder if he's really lost. Or if he's just the smartest man in the room, waiting for his moment. Because the story of the Genovese family isn't over. It's just waiting for the next man who's willing to sacrifice everything for a taste of the shadows. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most complex figures in criminal history. If you enjoyed this Netflix-style documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We have many more stories of power, betrayal, and the dark side of the American dream coming your way. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know who's really in charge.